So I think around relationships, a little bit around that, around authentically kind of building those relationships over time, kind of moving that relationship value. We're all trying to help each other and support each other, and it's a reciprocal
Because I
piece.
know this is one of the things that you talk about is around what you learned about high performance sports performance and then applying that into the workplace. So what are some of the kind of key takeaways? And was this something that sort of you learned in the sporting world, and then when you were meeting these very successful business people, you realized that there was that crossover, or how did that come about? Welcome, everyone. I am really, really excited about this podcast. I have known James for quite a while now, a number of years. So we actually met on Necker Island while I was playing tennis with Richard. It's a story for another day. But James was Richard's tennis coach, and we have stayed in touch. And now James is doing some really interesting stuff in the educational space. But the reason that I want to talk to James today was really he does a lot of work around high performance, and that's an area that I've been a big proponent of, looking at what we can learn from the sporting world and apply it to the business world. And then James is incredibly well connected, and just seems to do it very, very effortlessly and very naturally. And so hopefully he can share a few tips on that. So, James, do you want to just start with how you ended up teaching Richard Branson how to play tennis on Necker Island?
Yeah, no, thanks, and delighted to join you, Callum. I suppose to go back a step, so my background was professional sport. I was 145 in the world in tennis. Played Davis Cup for 10 years for Ireland. And then when I was coming to the end of my tennis career, I was in an ATP event, which is a for non-tennis people, it's with the exception of Grand Slams, it's one of the biggest events you can play. I was at the players' party. I kind of knew that I was coming to the end of my tennis career, and I was always really interested in business and entrepreneurship and meeting people and so on, but probably a little bit naive as well, which is a good thing, I think. And a couple of players they were talking about Richard Branson, saying, "Hey, did you hear Richard Branson has a tennis event on Necker called the Necker Cup?" I thought, wow, this is, incredible. And like a lot of people, I'm sure listening to this, I'd read the book, I'd read a couple of his books and so on. And I just found out that I had a loose connection to the guy who runs the event. So now loose is very loose. I knew someone, quite well who knew the guy. So and I think in those days, Facebook was probably more popular. I just sent him a Facebook message and I said, like, look, is there any way, this is my ranking. Is there any way that I can come out to the event, or can we arrange a call? So we had a call, and my pitch was really simple, that I kind of calculated that. So just to give, I suppose, your listeners the event, so that the Necker Cup is where, some of the most successful business people in the world come out to play with some of the best tennis players in the world. So you've had like Rafael Nadal has been there, Djokovic has been there, and Caroline Wozniacki and people like that. But my thought process was, I know tennis players, and I know they probably wouldn't want to be on the court all day because they're on holidays, and I thought that might be a concern for the organizers. And so I said, like, look, I'll stand on the court all day, so you'll never be short. You'll never be short a player.
Right.
And my philosophy was, what's the worst it can do? He's just going to say no, right? So he said yes. And almost like, I say sometimes when I speak to corporates and people, it's always, the power of one phone call or one conversation in terms of my career and my journey of where that one conversation has led to, in terms of going out to Necker, then meeting Richard, meeting, people like yourself, meeting all these amazing people on the island, and kind of the networks and things that have sprung out from that. So, yeah, so that's how I got there initially, and was lucky enough when I met Richard there then to, be invited back to coach him a couple of times, and I've been doing that. It's one of those things I never take it for granted, but I'm always very excited when the invitation comes.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I do remember meeting you there, and Richard does a very good job of making all of the team at Necker, like he selects people that are very naturally kind of outgoing and friendly and want to build relationships. But I was very struck by you, and I think, you've already kind of touched on it. You're sort of looking for those opportunities. So when you were in that environment. And obviously, I think the month before I was there, Barack Obama had been there. But literally, like the who's who of the world have been to that island, and it's quite incredible the connections that Richard has. So, how did you kind of go about? Because I know you've maintained relationships with a lot of people since just sort of meeting them in that environment. How have you gone about doing that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think for me, my philosophy has always been around, being curious and asking people lots of questions and learning and being genuinely interested. Like it's not a, it's not a fake thing that I'm doing. I think I'm curious in people. I like to read, I like to learn, I like to listen to people. I think that's one part. And then the second part is actually, when you meet someone that you kind of strike a rapport with, and look, it's not going to happen with every person, but when you strike a rapport with someone, I think it takes effort, relationships, right? And keeping in touch with someone and keeping in contact with someone. And in Keith Ferrazzi's book, Never Eat Alone, he talks around it's almost like stoking a fire. You're just kind of keeping that fire lit. I would consciously make an effort to, if I read something really interesting that I think, for example, just because we were talking about, I think Richard would be interested in, I would send it to him on an email and say, "Hey, just flagging this to you. Thought it might be interesting to you." So I do make a conscious effort with that stuff. But and then the second piece I always a piece of advice I got years ago was like read the newspaper every day or watch the news, or if I meet someone from aircraft leasing, for example, they're not expecting me to be an expert on the aircraft leasing industry, but if I know at a high level that I've seen an article that such and such is happening. So I think it's kind of having a good general knowledge around what's going on in the world. So those are kind of the things that I think, but being true to yourself and being authentic is something that I really believe in.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, LinkedIn has made it exponentially easier to do that and just to stay in touch with people. And I think that's kind of we connected on LinkedIn
Mm,
straight after. And then yeah, I kind of think I saw you posting about a new business that you had started, and we
mm.
just kind of stayed in touch. And it is easy, but it does take work. And the bigger your network, the more volume that there is. And it's yeah, without tools like LinkedIn, it would be very difficult. But yeah, you're on there fairly active on.
Yeah, yeah, I'd be very active on there and I'd share different things. But one of the things I think of in terms of cultivating relationships is, I would think about this thing called the relationship value. So, if I meet you at a conference and I get your card and I come home the next day and I have 20 cards and I look at them and I'm thinking, who's that Callum guy I met for 5 seconds, right? So that for me, that's a 1 out of 5 in terms of where we're at in our relationship. And a
Mhm.
5 out of 5 is, can you call someone on a Sunday afternoon, right? Because you just wouldn't do that for many people.
Mhm.
So I think around relationships, a little bit around that, around authentically kind of building those relationships over time, kind of moving that relationship value. And then also we had a networking course and the guy talked about he said it's like an ATM, it's around kind of going to get cash from an ATM in terms of, we're all trying to help each other and support each other and it's a reciprocal piece. So yeah, it's trying to build kind of long-term relationships with people. So, I mean, I'm not saying I have it completely like that is the only way to do it, but it's kind of
Yeah.
the way I've
So
done
I,
it.
I I think what I've noticed with a lot of people is that they will meet somebody and then they will only go back to them when they need something,
Mm,
or they will meet someone, and if they can't see what they can get from them straight away, they're going to move
yeah.
on to the next person. And I think both you and I kind of probably have a much broader sense of that, and also, if I'm going to ask a favor of someone in my network, I want to have already done several favors for them ahead of time and try to connect them to interesting people, or
Yeah,
like
yeah,
you said, send them an interesting article or something like that ahead of
yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. Like we all know those people who, if their number flashes up on your phone, you're thinking, oh, what do they want? Like, what do they want now? Like, it's never like, how can I help you and how are you or whatever. So,
Yeah.
um, there's no, yeah, it's not an easy thing. And I appreciate sometimes, so I've been with Richard like for, years and years. So I've seen, in environments where someone might come for, they might come for a couple of days or I was in Dublin with him where we were at an event and, people feel like they have one shot and one opportunity to pitch him or whatever it is. So I get that as well. Like I think it's just EQ and just reading the situation and having a
Yeah,
really
I
good.
mean, we touched on this in when I was in London, and we caught up, and I remember when I was there was probably like a group of 20 or 25 of us, and varying degrees of entrepreneurship success, but everybody wanted to pitch Richard on something. And what was interesting was I didn't really like, obviously that was the first time I'd met Richard, so he seemed engaged with everyone. He listened politely, but what I noticed was there were some kids as well, and when he was engaged with the kids, he was
Mm,
completely different. Like he was
mm,
genuinely alive and happy and chatting to them, and I realized that the rest of the time he just kind of had this sort of mask on that I guess a
yeah,
lot of us put on, yeah, just to kind of get through the
yeah, yeah,
constant pitching. It did strike me when you're in that level, in that position, it
yeah,
must just be relentless, that like just
yeah,
constantly being pitched. It was, which is why when I had my time with him, I was so very like deliberately, I'm not going to pitch,
yeah,
but had to find another way to engage with him. But again, a different
yeah.
topic.
Yeah, different topic. Yeah, no, yeah. No,
But
I think you're, I think
yeah, I
you're,
mean,
I think
you must have seen that, like the amount of times you've been with him, like is everyone's just constantly pitching him. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and look, I get it from again. I'm, and he gets it as well. And I think this is a wider point just in terms of like network and relationship building, but it's around like, actually doing your research around the person and what interests them, and also with someone like him, I would look at it and say, in Dublin, for example, his wife was there and his executive assistant, who's like, basically is so heavily involved in what he's doing, and and they were standing there kind of, and no one was kind of speaking to them, and I was thinking like,
yes,
if you'd done a little bit of research, and I look, this is not an easy thing to do, but I'm thinking that actually might have been a better route than hundreds of people trying to go to him, right? So I think the wider point is do your research, and then the second point I forgot to make is actually one of the guests who came through Necker was Chris Sacca, so lowercase capital, one of the most successful investors. And it really, and there's lots of different videos and interviews with him. So I'm not breaking confidence, but one of the things he speaks about is like just be interesting. Like he's like, I like meeting interesting people. So, for me, and like he talks about like people that have worked terrible jobs, people that have traveled the world, people that have, hitchhiked across, like just be interesting, right? I think
yeah,
sometimes we forget about that in terms of we think about, I have to do this course, or I have to get this degree, or I have to tick this box or whatever. When, sometimes it's just around like, just be a fascinating person, be someone that, would you want to sit beside this person at dinner effectively? And I think that's
yeah.
a good, measure.
No, that's very true. And I think a lot of us, we tend to have done very cool things and then just forget about them and move on to the next thing. We're often living in the future. A couple of points around that, because it is very applicable to building networks beyond that, is, yeah, again, as I said to you, I think that if you look at Richard, he isn't actually involved in a lot of the businesses. If you're actually pitching something for the private equity side or for Virgin Unite or for Virgin Galactic, whatever these businesses, actually he's not really the person to be
Mm,
pitching about, like, and what his interest, a lot of his interests around the charity side now rather than
yeah.
the business side. So actually if you can get the next tier down, and I remember exactly to your point, I was at a banking event with Toto Wolff from
Oh
Mercedes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and that's another legend. And yeah, of course, the entire room was focused on him. And then his PA was standing at the back all alone. And I was like, oh, what a great opportunity. I'll go and talk to her. And yeah, of course, much, much easier to talk to her and find out where he was going to be later and what he was
Yeah,
interested
yeah,
in. But it's a
100%.
very good point.
Who's the gatekeeper? Like, who's the, who holds the keys, basically? And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think I think you, especially with people like that, you have to be a little bit creative in terms of how you kind of get to them. And I think it's like purposeful. It's thinking through things and think, when you go to an event, it's not just like if we, move back from someone like Richard Branson, it's not just him, but if you go to an event, it's actually like knowing who's going to attend, like being targeted on who you want to speak to. And I think sometimes, and like, look, I've been guilty of this. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but you kind of go to an event and it just kind of gets you get a bit lost in it. Like, and there's not, it's like, it's a good day out, but it's not really a purposeful day.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing as well is coming at it from the point of view of what could I do for this person that I've just met? Yeah, who could I connect them to? In my book, Progressive Partnerships, I talk about it's like a cheap round. Like if you connect two interesting people together, it doesn't cost you anything, but now everyone owes you a favor. It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah. The law,
it's a really effective tool for that. So
but
well,
the
look,
law,
awesome, awesome discussion on networks, and like I said, you have embodied this and have built up an incredible network, which hopefully is being reflected now in your business success as you grow that. Let's switch over to the performance side because I know this is one of the things that you talk about in your company and to your clients is around what you learned about high performance sports performance and then applying that into the workplace. So what are some of the kind of key takeaways and was this something that sort of you learned in the sporting world and then when you were meeting these very successful business people you realized that there was that crossover or how did that come about?
yeah. So it's a really, really good question. I think the first piece is the piece. So as a tennis player, look, you're very goal orientated in terms of your ranking is, I said to you, my highest ranking was 145. Obviously there's a journey there where you're trying to climb up the rankings. Initially, I struggled a little bit performance wise on the tour. I was kind of very inconsistent. And then I was introduced to a sports psychologist, and he asked me just very simple questions around, how many points do you need to be 250 in the world, right? So stating the obvious, but the better you do, the more points you accumulate and so on, and the more you move up the rankings. I loosely knew how many points I needed, but I wasn't quite clear on exactly what I needed to do. So what we did was we created this pyramid of results, and so we got clear on the vision of what I needed to do. The vision was clear, and then worked backwards from that in terms of, well, what do you need to do on a daily basis to help you achieve those goals, right? So previously I was going to every tennis event and I was putting so much pressure on myself to win,
Right.
whereas now actually I took a step back and I thought, well, if I take care of these little goals, if I do my shoulder rehab, if I hit 100 serves a day, if I hit all these, and I'd kind of have these little metric goals
Mhm.
that I would tick off, and it gave me the confidence that actually the big goal would take care of itself.
Mhm.
And then if I fast forward, my mentor, a guy who I met on Necker through with Richard is a guy called Kurt Long, who's an entrepreneur who's scaled a number of businesses. And I remember like one of our first conversations, I asked him about goal setting and what his opinion of goal setting was. And he said, look, the biggest key is what is the vision and work backwards from that as much as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and this is a guy who's scaled a number of companies. And I think it's very similar to sport. I think there's a lot of crossover there. The second piece, I think, which is really interesting, which actually has evolved since the end of my tennis career, I think is the piece around rest and recovery has become, much more talked about in terms of, obviously Team Sky and the cycling, we're talking about marginal gains and how they be traveling with their own pillows and beds and all that sort of stuff. But I do think, I have friends that are still on the tour and still doing really well in tennis. And I think one of the evolutions is a lot more emphasis on rest and recovery, and looking at like being fresh. And I think in business, I think that's evolved as well, right? I think people are starting to think more around that in terms of whether it's breath work or whether it's making sure you get out for a walk in the morning or wellness or whatever it is for you. But so I think there's things we can learn both ways if I'm being honest. But I think those are kind of two of the key things that really stand out for me.
Yeah, I mean, I was very, I think we've touched on this, but the All Blacks, who had the highest win rate of any sports team internationally, and they brought in a mental skills coach. So it was a long time ago, certainly before anyone was talking about mental skills. A guy called Bert Anoka, and then they also brought in Kerry Evans, I think his name is, who's then gone on to work with Arsenal and some of the Formula One teams and others. And I do remember reading about that, and basically the philosophy had changed from rugby was a very amateur event where involved a lot of heavy drinking, and that was kind of that was the
Yeah,
training routine, and then it kind of professionalized, and they had a lot of those hangovers from the amateur era that they were trying to get rid of. And one of the things they started doing was saying, well, look, it's natural for us to have a ball skills coach, but we also need to have a nutritionist, and there's no nutritionist in the world that's going to recommend you down 20 pints after a game. And by the way, if we're doing that, and if we're putting all this pressure on sports players to perform, then we also need to be looking at the mental game of things.
mm,
And so they brought that in, and it was long before I'd seen anyone else talking about it. And the parallel for me was I was thinking, why are they investing so much money? And I was quite skeptical at that time. I was kind of, yeah. So the idea of mental skills was sort of a very vague and fuzzy 15, 20 years ago.
yeah,
But the reason they were doing it was this was an investment. They were paying, I mean, rugby's relatively low, but they were paying hundreds of thousands a year to these
mm,
individuals, and it was worth millions in sponsorships and TV rights and everything else if the team won. And therefore, it made sense for them to invest in putting together the nutritionist and the strength coach and the mental skills coach. And the parallel to me with an entrepreneur like yourself that is building a business, that equally what the decisions you make and the growth of your company is worth millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions potentially, or billions. Why wouldn't you
mm,
surround yourself, like as you're the owner of the company and you get to benefit from those? Why wouldn't you surround yourself with the best possible team to get the best possible outcome for you?
yeah.
And that really, I remember that kind of was a real wake up call in terms of how I started working with business coaches and other people around me to try and get the best performance from myself.
Yeah, you're right. You're really right. And there's a good book, and maybe people have heard of it before, but it was a rower. So it wasn't Steve Redgrave. So Steve Redgrave won, I think, 4 goals, but it was one of the guys that rowed with him.
Matthew Pinson?
Yeah, I don't know if it was Matthew. There was 4 of them in the boat, but
Yeah,
the boat,
I remember the other
the
one.
book was called "Will It Make the Boat Go Faster?" And basically, their whole philosophy was, will the decisions we're making today make the boat go faster on the water? So, like, is this serving us in terms of the boat going faster? And I think in business, sometimes, we can, a day can run away from us, or we can be doing something which is, maybe not a high priority, maybe it's a low priority. We're doing things that maybe aren't serving us or serving the business. And like, coming back to that decision of, will the decision I'm making, will it make the boat go faster in essence? Like even something like as simple as email. So Chris Sack, who I mentioned earlier in the conversation, he talks around email being, he says when you're on email, you're on someone else's to-do list, and like obviously people talk about having windows to do your email and then focusing on tasks and different things like that. But I think the wider point is essentially, will it make the boat go faster? The second piece, and you touched on in terms of coaching and support and so on, and it's kind of relates to the first part of the conversation, but it's simply the networks and the people that you surround yourself with. And like if I use an example from my tennis career, so I'm from Ireland. I was the number one player in Ireland. I was training in Ireland a little bit, and the players were. I'm not trying to be, but they weren't as good as me in that kind of training camp or whatever, right? And actually, a friend of mine, an Indian guy, invited me to India to come and train with Rohan Bopanna, Mahesh Bhupathi, and Sanya Mirza, who are some of the top male and female players in the world. And for me, like, and there was a really good coach there. I went over the first part of it is I thought like, they were going to reinvent the wheel, that they were going to do all these different drills and exercises that were radically different to what we were doing in Dublin,
Mm.
which wasn't the case. But I think the second piece was it was just that level of standards that they delivered on, that it was just that little bit, it was more in terms of work rate, environment, expectation. And I think that's where, something like, a good coach, a good environment, a good support network. It's lonely as a business owner, like, that support system can really help and really encourage you, really drive you.
Yeah.
So I think those are the things that make the difference. And again, we're coming back to people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a concept that I take to heart, and I actually talk about in my latest book, The Boardroom Blueprint. I talk about going from being the best rower in a boat to being the worst rower in a boat. And the difference was just incredible. When I was the best rower in the boat, I was constantly trying to balance out other people's mistakes. When I was the worst rower in a boat, all I needed to do was concentrate on getting better. And I just, I was constantly being inspired to get better. And I didn't have to worry about other people doing the wrong thing. And I just got so much better in 2 or 3 months of sitting in a group of elite rowers and having that opportunity. And so in my business world, for example, at the Veblen Director Program, it's all about surrounding yourself with people that are already sitting on boards. So if everybody is sitting on a board, it just becomes natural for you to go and sit on a board. And if all the companies you work with have boards, then why wouldn't you have a board of directors for your own company? And so I'm a huge believer in that, shifting your environment so that you are surrounded by people that are playing a bigger game than you and can get that sort of expertise by default. It's a good
Yeah, yeah,
story. Yeah,
yeah.
cool.
Because we were, I was at a dinner last night, and a couple of the guys were, and I don't know, like I know you're in Singapore, so I'd be curious on the kind of mindset piece. But he was talking about like in America, the attitude to someone kind of starting a business and stuff in terms of positivity compared to the UK, or I would put Ireland in there a little bit as well.
Mm.
Terms of other countries, like the people might not be as positive in terms of like they look for what's, and I know I'm kind of generalizing a little bit, but I just think it's around getting around who encourage you and support you. And then Kurt, who I mentioned, but my mentor who and I mentioned he worked for NASA one stage, like early in his career, and he talked about this thing called, he in one of the sessions he talked about radical truth, like how you need to, like he's like, if we make a mistake on the spaceship, if we put a bolt in a different position or whatever it is, the spaceship could obviously explode and people lose their life, right? So you need radical truth in terms of what's happening.
Mm.
And I think sometimes we need people around us that we trust and that can give us that radical truth as well. And it's just that support system.
Yeah, I think it's important. And I actually think it's less to do with any potential stereotypes about different countries. I think it's more to do with oftentimes you just need to get out of your own environment because the people that you've grown up with, they want you to stay the same because they love you as how you are. And there's a reason why a lot of the best businesses in the world were set up by immigrants or expatriates in different countries, because when you're in a different country, you don't have that support system. You're often outside of the normal rules of kind of getting a job and those sort of things. And so oftentimes you are in this environment where actually kind of the best opportunity is to set up a business and you don't have your mates around you that want you to stay the way that you've always been and will kind of give you a bit of a ribbing if you're
Yeah.
going to do things that they're not used to you doing. It gives you an opportunity to sort of escape that. So whether you don't necessarily need to go to a different country, but it's interesting how many people that are immigrants in one way or another have been able to turn that into successful entrepreneurial careers just because they've changed that environment.
Yeah, there's a good book called The Last Lecture. So a guy called Randy Pausch. Have you heard of it, Callum, or
Yes,
is
it did a yeah. So when he died, unfortunately, it got quite a lot of coverage, didn't it?
yeah, he died of pancreatic cancer, and he like a university lecturer essentially does it when they're retiring. They do a last lecture, but he did the last lecture when he was obviously, dying, and it was more, he said he did it for his kids, obviously, who were young, and he was a young guy, so it's really sad. Like, but one of the things he said, one of the slides he has, you can decide in your life, are you a Tigger or an eel? Or a Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, So it's like, are you the positive kind of can do, or are you the like? And look, we all have that decision, and like it's like you said, I think during the call, in terms of we all kind of play characters in our life as well, different environments, different, you're different in your work mode compared to your personal life mode or whatever it is. But yeah, what you choose, what way you show up, essentially.
Cool. So I just want to finish up on, and look, this has been fascinating, and it's always fun chatting, and I think we share a lot of ideas. But so I want to finish up on, you've got now some great clients that are bringing you in to work with their teams and their executives. What are some of the common problems, and what are the key things that you're helping those executives to move through, or their clients?
Yeah, so my company's called Give Learn.
Yeah,
So
maybe explain, like, for context, give a little bit of what your company does.
Yeah, so we work with companies really of varying sizes. So Give Learn, the learning solution, primarily with small and medium-sized businesses.
Hmm.
So we have a full calendar of live, virtual, and on-demand classes, all in the area of soft skills or human skills. So soft skills being, communications, leadership, presentation skills, managing difficult conversations, all that area.
Mhm.
And we have presenters from around the world that deliver classes and courses. I do some on high performance, but I bring in a lot of experts and people like Kurt, who I mentioned. We've had rocket scientists, entrepreneurs, business leaders, and so on. That's one side of the business. And then the second side is we also build bespoke, development programs for companies based on their needs. So we just ran one last week called Scaling Your Leadership for a US multinational in Dublin. So, some of the topics and themes that are really coming up around leadership, around difficult conversations, around culture, those kind of areas are interesting. Also things I think around like time management. And I say time management in the essence of we're all really busy, but how do you actually prioritize your time? And again, coming back to that, will it make the boat go faster? And then lastly, I'd just say is to your listeners or people watching is, obviously AI is doing so many different things. And there's, recent research from Harvard that 85% of job success comes from having well-developed soft and people skills, 15% from technical or hard skills. Are you investing enough in your employees or in yourself in terms of your own kind of, skill development in that space, wherever it is? Those are kind of the areas, along with obviously a little bit of one-to-one executive coaching as well, but really supporting people in terms of whatever their goals are. But those are kind of the topics and themes that are coming up.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, look, AI is a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
It's
But yeah. How long have you got? I saw actually Reid Hoffman being interviewed by his
by
avatar.
himself. I know, it's crazy.
That's crazy, like.
Yeah. Well, I can assure you, this is me.
Yeah. Which Callum is speaking
I would say that, wouldn't I?
to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's mad. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
James, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Tons of really good wisdom shared there. Lots of takeaways for people. So really appreciate your time. And yeah, look forward to catching up again soon.
Right. If anyone wants to connect with me, probably LinkedIn is the best space.
Yeah,
So,
we'll put your links in the show notes as well.
right. All right. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Cheers, James.
Thanks, Callum. See you later.